Good afternoon. It is the 21st of September 2020. I will talk about the recent randomized study which has been uploaded in medRxiv. It is yet to be published, but it is a randomized study by the Icmr. It had about 642 or 44 patients of confirmed COVID-19 divided into two groups. The first group received standard therapy with plasma and the control group received only standard therapy. The researchers have concluded that over a span of 1 month, there was no significant reduction in clinical outcomes or mortality with convalescent plasma. Now, this conclusion is subject to criticism because we have data from the Mayo Clinic of almost 35,000 confirmed COVID-19 patients. Though this was not a randomized study, this study showed that plasma had to be given before 3 days of symptom onset. If it was given after 3 days of symptom onset, then the effects were much lesser. The exact conclusions were that at 7 days, when plasma was given within 3 days of symptom onset, mortality was just 9%, and when it was given after 3 days, mortality was 12%. Therefore, a reduction of almost 3%. And at 28 days, mortality was 27% versus 22% when plasma was given beyond 3 days and before 3 days. The other important thing which the Mayo group have concluded is that plasma had to be containing high titers of antibodies, which means that if you have plasma which has high titers, high quantities of antibodies, then that plasma will be more effective than plasma which has lower titers of antibodies. Now we come back to the Indian trial. The Indian trial has given plasma about 8 days after symptom onset, so therefore it was not given at the right time. And secondly, the quantum of antibodies was very low. In fact, it was almost non-existent because the dilution factor was 1:20 and probably a mean factor of 1:40. The plasma is effective if there is a dilution of antibodies of 1:80 at least. The Americans have concluded that the plasma has to have high quantums of antibodies because the response is graded. When the antibodies are low, the response is less, and if the quantum of antibodies is high, that means the plasma is rich with antibodies, and if this rich plasma is given within 3 days, then the effects are much nicer. The Mayo Clinic data, of course, was not randomized. It did not have controls, so therefore one cannot make definitive conclusions. However, there is another study which was randomized, which had much fewer patients, only 85 or 86, which was published from Netherlands. This has been published, and this has shown that when plasma was given about 6 to 7 days after symptom onset, the plasma was ineffective. It was ineffective because the patients already had their own antibodies against the COVID-19 virus, which means, again, that the plasma has to be given much earlier. I am highlighting on the plasma because there are not rumors, but it is a fact that plasma is being sold in the black in India. The plasma which is being sold also has no indication of the quantum of antibodies it is carrying. So therefore, if you have a loved one who has COVID-19 and who needs plasma, it must be given within 3 or 4 days of symptom onset, and one must make sure that the quantum of antibodies are good, they are high, they are not low quantum. In the Indian study, the problem was that they took plasma from donors who had mild COVID-19. It is well established by now that people who are asymptomatic or who have mild symptoms, they do not produce as many antibodies as those who have moderate to severe infection with COVID-19. So therefore, these are the drawbacks of the Icmr study. First, it was not blinded. Second, the plasma was given too late. And third, the quantum of plasma in the donated plasma was not adequate. It was, in fact, suboptimal. I mentioned about the plasma because there was a major controversy in the United States of America. Earlier, there were two people who were very much against the emergency authorization for plasma usage in the US. These were Anthony Fauci, who is the chief of the National Institute of Allergic Diseases and Infective Diseases, plus Francis Collins, who is the chief of the National Institute of Health. But their objections were overruled by the government, that is by President Trump, who ensured that the chief of the FDA, that is Hahn, Dr. Hahn, publicly stated that the FDA was granting emergency authorization of plasma usage in the US, despite the fact that there was no randomized study in the US or in the world which had shown that there was a significant reduction in mortality with plasma. But of course, we have the Chinese study, which was earlier published in The Lancet, which had only 100 patients, which showed that when plasma was given in patients who required oxygen, there was a reduction in the duration of infective period, but there was no reduction in mortality. But when the plasma was given in patients who were already on ventilators or who were in shock, then there was no effect with the usage of plasma. The study suggested, again very strongly, that plasma has to be given earlier in the patients who have COVID-19 rather than waiting for 8 to 10 days when the patients had sickened too much. So we have enough data that plasma, though not reducing mortality in randomized trials, does improve clinical outcomes in the sense that recovery is shortened when the plasma is given early, within 3 days of symptom onset, and when it is carrying enough antibodies. The controversy on the plasma usage in the US was this, that Hahn, the chief of the FDA, publicly announced in the presence of Donald Trump that there was a 35% reduction in mortality with plasma, which of course was a complete nonsensical statement, because there was actually a 35% relative reduction in mortality by the use of plasma in the Mayo Clinic data, and which again, as I've already mentioned, was not randomized. Now I must explain to you what is relative reduction and what is absolute reduction. Let us say we are checking a new tablet, right? We take 2,000 patients. We take 2,000 patients and divide them into two groups of 1,000 each. One we will call the treated group, in which we will use this tablet. The other group would be called the control group, in which we would use a dummy tablet, which means that the tablet does not carry any ingredients. So we have one is the control group and the other is the treated group. The treated group will get the tablet. Now we look at the results. After a period of 2 months, we find that 10 people die in the control group, which received the dummy tablet, and 5 people die in the treated group, which received the tablet we are testing. Now this means the mortality has come down from 10 to 5, which means that there is a 50% reduction in mortality. Now 50% reduction in mortality is a huge number. That's a humongous number, and which is a flashpoint, right? Now you have to raise red flags here, because this is a relative reduction. Actually what has happened? Actually what has happened is that there were 10 deaths in the control group, which means that mortality was 0.1%, and there were 5 deaths in the treated group, which means that mortality was 0.05%, which means in reality, in absolute terms, mortality came down by 0.05%, which is clinically not very big. It is in fact pretty small and would be considered as is a minuscule clinical outcome data. So therefore one would be very, very, very cautious in, or rather would be hesitant in giving big news stories that the drug is effective. So remember, despite the fact that the relative reduction in mortality here in this hypothetical case which I'm mentioning was 50%, in actual terms mortality came down from 0.1% to 0.05%, which is very, very small and is of negligible clinical importance. So now what did Hahn say? Hahn, in this public press conference, went ahead and said that there was a 35% absolute reduction of mortality, which was again a misleading statement, and he was severely criticized by a lot of scientists and by a lot of clinicians in the US. And then he backtracked. Luckily, he backtracked and said, look, actually I meant this was a relative reduction of 35%, which of course was a fact. In the Mayo Clinic study, there was a relative reduction of 35% at 7 days and a relative reduction of about 23% at 30 days when plasma with high quantities of antibodies and when this plasma was used within 3 days of symptom onset. It was effective, but again, because there were no controls, because this was not a randomized study, we cannot draw very firm conclusions. All that we can infer is that there is a signal that plasma, when given early, is effective to some extent. Now we move on from the plasma story of the US and the Icmr study, which has been put up on the medRxives website. We move on to the vaccines. The vaccines are rolling in very soon, but you must understand that the vaccines are not a magic bullet. They are not the, they will not be the gold standard. They will not be the ultimate and the all-time treatment for COVID-19. The vaccines do not seem to be coming before the end of this year, despite Donald Trump touting that there will be a possibility that the vaccines may be available by October end, before the American elections. So we can see once again that there is a huge political pressure in the US also and in the West of launching a vaccine before it has been actually studied thoroughly. Now I am raising this point because we have these two women in the AstraZeneca trial who developed transverse myelitis. One developed it in July, the second one developed it in August. In both cases, AstraZeneca did not go public. It is only when probably somebody actually gave out the information that Stat, which is a news outlet, brought out the story that sometimes last month a lady had developed transverse myelitis. AstraZeneca then had to pause their trials. This was the phase 3 trial. Already 18,000 participants had received their vaccines all across 3 or 4 countries. That was Britain, Brazil, the US, South Africa, and I think also India. The problem is that 2 cases of transverse myelitis could be a lot, because if now you have a 3rd case of transverse myelitis, which may or may not be connected with the vaccine, there could be a major problem. There would be a major problem, because then there would be a hue and cry that this vaccine, this sort of vaccine, that is the adenovirus vaccine, is too toxic for human use, too toxic for use in millions of people. Because remember, we are about to vaccinate the entire population of the planet, which is 7 billion people. 7 billion people will receive a vaccine on 2 occasions. One on 0 day and one on 21st day, or after a month. So we are talking about 14 billion vaccine doses for the world. And if we have even 1 or 2 cases of transverse myelitis in just 18,000 patients, that could multiply into hundreds of thousands of cases of transverse myelitis. But of course, to the credit of AstraZeneca, they have studied these 2 cases. They have constituted an independent body which has gone into the details of these cases. The minute details are not with us. As I mentioned earlier, we don't know the ages of these 2 ladies. We don't know at what point they developed transverse myelitis. We are still not sure. Of course, AstraZeneca is suggesting that the transverse myelitis was not related to the vaccine, and therefore the trial has resumed. It has resumed in Britain, in South Africa, in Brazil, and in India also. But if a 3rd person or even just 4 people develop a serious neurological complication, we will have a major problem. We will have to then abort all the other companies which are making the adenovirus vector vaccines. That means the Chinese are making it, the Russians are making it, and Johnson & Johnson is also making the same sort of a vaccine. Now, if we have 3 or 4 people who develop transverse myelitis or Guillain-Barré syndrome, these are major neurological problems, then that means something is wrong. And if an independent body actually connects either the gene which is being carried by the virus, or the virus itself is triggering the neurological problems, then there will be a major halt and we will be back to square one. In the meantime, Moderna and Pfizer are carrying on with their phase 3 trials with the messenger RNA vaccines. We are yet to know the results. Fortunately and mercifully, we have not heard of any major problems with these vaccines. But we must bear in mind that these are experimental vaccines which have never been used before. The Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are messenger RNA vaccines. The gene is carried. The gene then tells the human cell to produce the spikes of the Chinese virus, and the spikes then trigger an immune response, which then is supposed to tackle a future infection with COVID-19. Now, thousands and thousands of patients are being tested with these vaccines, but the important thing is that the studies can be stopped because of two major considerations. The first is that a serious adverse event occurs, or a couple of, or maybe 3 or 4 serious adverse events occur, which suggest that the vaccine is not safe, which means that the trial is halted, all the money which has been invested in the companies goes to dust. The other thing is that we find that the vaccine is actually effective. Now, that number surprisingly is very small. For instance, for the AstraZeneca virus vaccine, it is said that the safety monitoring body or committee just needs 75 people who are infected. And if in these 75 people who are infected, the vaccine shows an efficacy of 50%, or rather a 50% reduction in the development of the disease, then it can be approved as per the regulations made by the FDA. Now, this bar of 50% is very low, but it is the same as that of the influenza virus. Even the influenza virus is effective in just about 40 or 50% of people in which it is used. Very uncommonly, it can be effective up to 60%. Some scientists are suggesting, and I agree with them, that the bar must be raised for the COVID-19 to about 60 or 65 or even 70%. 50% is a very low bar, because if you just have 75 cases of COVID-19 divided in the vaccinated group and in the control group, and you find that there is a 50% reduction in the infection rate, and you say, okay, the virus is good enough, and now we don't need any further phase 3 trial, we can approve the vaccine, then that could be a problem also, because we would never then be able to pick up the serious adverse events which might come up later. So remember, even though the vaccine is not with us, we should not be despondent. There is no reason to be disappointed, because now we know how to handle these cases. As I've mentioned earlier, we know that oxygen works, we know that anticoagulants work, we know that remdesivir works, we know that dexamethasone works, and we believed that an interleukin-6 inhibitor called tocilizumab will also work, but the company which manufactures tocilizumab called Roche carried out a randomized study which showed that tocilizumab did not improve clinical outcomes, nor did it reduce mortality significantly. And therefore, that was a big downer. But not unsurprisingly, that data was submerged. One never heard about it. It was, quietly kept hidden somewhere. But now, with a great fanfare, Roche has come out with another study called, I think, Icmr, or I don't know the name of the study, but this again is a randomized study which is showing that although tocilizumab does not reduce mortality, it did improve clinical outcomes in the sense that people requiring ventilation were less. So the clinical endpoint was a combination of the requirement for ventilation and mortality. And this was reduced from 19% to 12% with the use of tocilizumab injections, but mortality remained at 10% in people who were sick with COVID-19, but who as yet did not need ventilation. So I mention this because, once again, tocilizumab was being sold in black in India, and this is an amazing thing. And I have to go back to a book which I read years ago. I read decades back, and this was an excellent book which I highly recommend. It was written by Camus. It is called The Plague. This is a must-read book. And Camus describes in great detail a town, a fictitious town, which is hit by a plague, by a bacteria. This was the plague itself. And the pandemic then throws up people who are of the worst kind, and also people who are fine and people who have great integrity, as the main protagonist in the book, in the novel, who is a doctor. And then we have these black marketeers who are the scum of the town, and who exploit the miseries, the deaths of the people by black marketing stuff. And that is exactly what is happening in this country. There is very little regulation on this, but this is a fact. And I'm sure those of you who have been a victim of this disease, or who know people who have been victims of this disease, have run helter-skelter looking for tocilizumab or even plasma, because, as I've mentioned, both were being sold and are still being sold in the black in India. Now, what else do I speak about in this talk? The other thing, of course, is this big thing by the British. The British are, they're talking about some sort of an Operation Moonshot. The Operation Moonshot means that the British government will, in a single day, check 10 million people for COVID-19, which means that they will be checking 1 crore people every day in England. And the cost of this would be $100 billion. Now, that is a huge sum for the British, because remember, the money which NHS is given per year is $130 billion. So now the British are committing themselves to spending $100 billion. That is almost 3/4 of the money which is used, which is provided to the NHS simply for picking up cases. Now, this is an absurd proposition. Again, keeping in mind that the British spend $41 billion in their defense budget. So now, just picking up cases without any infrastructure still available. Right now, their detection of cases is pretty shabby as it is. And at the end of the year, if they start spending so much money at the cost of the NHS, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of patients over there, of suffering from cancer, from diabetes, from heart failure, that would be very unfair. Now, the reason is, again, very now familiar. The reason is that the British government, Boris Johnson and his health minister, both are consulting in an agency which is bereft of any clinicians, doctors, or epidemiologists. This is a consultancy firm. I think it's called the Boston Consultancy Firm. And this is a group of people who have no scientific basis or no scientific knowledge. So it is surprising that the United Kingdom is being advised not by scientists, not by clinicians, and not by epidemiologists, but by a consultancy firm which is asking them to spend $100 billion simply to pick up cases of COVID-19. And I've already told you that cases simply means people detected by an RT-PCR, which again is not infallible. There are always chances of false positives and chances of false negatives. Even if you have a false positive rate of 1%, then in a crore, you will have 100,000 people who are falsely diagnosed as COVID-19. And if you test 60 million people, you will have 600,000 people who would be tested who would be bracketed as COVID-19, despite the fact that they are not. And it would be a shame to isolate such people and also isolate their contacts. Which brings us to the data in Delhi. Once again, in Delhi, I think about 3,800 cases were picked up yesterday or the day before. Earlier, for about 4 or 5 days, there were 4,000 cases which were being picked up. But now in Delhi, there are more than 60,000 cases which are being tested. The testing is to the tune of 60 to 62,000. So obviously there will be more cases picked up. But remember, the tests being done are largely the rapid antigen tests, which are neither sensitive nor are they specific. Only 15% of the tests are being done by the PCR technique, which again can have false positives and false negatives. So simply being a case, especially if you are asymptomatic, does not mean that you are suffering from COVID-19. It could also mean that either you do not have COVID-19 or that you've had COVID-19 and you are just carrying non-infective remnants of the virus. The other important story is that you have this device which has been published, not been published. Yes, the data has been published in the Lancet, and this has been produced under the supervision of the Imperial College of London. This is a gadget called COVID nudge apparatus. The gadget is as large as a shoe box, and this is a complete factory. This is a complete laboratory which is doing the RT-PCR test. But this will give you a result in only 90 minutes. And there is a caveat, you can only do one test. So therefore in a day you can just do about 15 or 16 tests. But the advantage is that the laboratory can be carried to your home or to your clinic. And the technique is very simple. It is suggested that all you need is a swab from your nose or even from your saliva that is put into a cartridge. It is a small cartridge, and then the cartridge deactivates the virus. After deactivating the virus, it purifies the virus, and then it picks up the genes of the COVID-19 or the China virus, and it is trained to pick up 6 genes, that is N1, N2, N3, the envelope and the nucleocapsid and the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase 1 and the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase 2. So it has the ability to pick up 6 genes. So therefore it is quite specific for the China virus. And there is a study which is published. It took about, I think, about 600 or 800 people. Most of them were health workers who were thought to be suspected to be suffering from COVID-19. And some were people who went to the emergency in a hospital, and some were people who were already admitted with or without COVID-19. And the specificity of this test was 100%, which is fantastic. And the sensitivity was almost 94%, which means if there are 100 patients who are confirmed cases of COVID-19 as assessed by the polymerase chain reaction test, you can pick up 94 by the shoebox stuff called the COVID nudge apparatus. Now the COVID nudge technique is quite simple. It picks up the virus, it deactivates the virus, it purifies the virus, and then it starts to amplify the virus. It starts to make the virus bigger and bigger. The number of viruses are increased to the tune of millions and billions, and then they are assessed for the presence of the China virus vaccine. Now, I don't know the cost of this particular gadget, but it has been bought by the British government. But I don't think the British government will be able to do their moonshot strike with this gadget, because as I've said, this gadget can give you a result in 90 minutes. It can give you a result in your home or in a clinic, but it can just do 15 or 16 cases in a day, and it can do just one case. So if you have an IPL match and you have about 70,000 people coming in to watch the IPL match, then it would be impossible to use this gadget. But the gadget has its, as I mentioned, it has its advantages, because normally the RT-PCR test comes back after a day in India, and apparently in the US it can take from 3 to 4 days to even 7 days, in which case the test is almost useless. Now with this I will stop today's talk. If you have liked this talk, then please press the bell icon and do share this with your friends and with your relatives, because if you share it with your friends and relatives, and if you press the bell icon and if you press the like icon, then I also get inspired. I also get the strength to carry on with these talks on COVID-19. Thank you very much. Have a good Monday. Thank you very much.